Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I take this opportunity to thank the NFP leadership team for so graciously extending me this invitation. It truly is an honour to be addressing an occasion, albeit a sad one, such as this, that is hosted by Fiji's oldest political party, and one that has weathered all manner of storms, schisms, and internal conflicts, and what was arguably Fiji's first coup of 1977. Your longevity of more than half a century is a rare thing in this country. That in itself is a remarkable testament to the unwavering resilience of your body politic, of your members and your leaders. I first met Professor Brij Lal a little over 10 years ago at a pro-democracy conference in Queanbeyan, which is just outside Canberra in Australia. We had a brief discussion, but it wasn't until last year that we started to have a regular correspondence, mainly via email, and then telephone calls where we discussed everything from books on Fiji, the Girmitia, prominent figures from Fiji's history, including A.D. Patel, Siddiq Koya, Ratumara, and Brij's biography, which was quite extraordinary, on the equally extraordinary Jairam Reddy. Brij and I reviewed and edited each other's articles before they went to publication. Every conversation invariably ended up with the two of us whinging about the state of Fiji's politics. We whined about the failure of this nation to deliver on the promise and the potential that was very much alive at the dawn of its independence. As Brij wrote recently, here we have a beautiful country which has everything going for it, but it tends to suffer from irregular episodes of self-inflicted wounds. One coup, he wrote recently, is bad enough for any country, but 3 or 4 in short succession is sheer madness. And yet, despite this history of upheavals, there has never really been any kind of a critical inquiry or serious reflection to examine why do these events keep repeating themselves? Why does Fiji continue to keep digging a hole for itself? To use the good professor's metaphor, its leaders keep sweeping the dust under the carpet, but the dust never goes away. I'm going to use a far more simple analogy, if I may. It is rather like we have built a house. We move in, but the house keeps collapsing. It keeps falling apart. And then we try and rebuild, and we look at the roof and we start to rebuild the roof, and it collapses again and again. At some point, the most obvious question that it begs is, why are we rebuilding the roof when we should be looking at the foundations of this house? For Brij Lal, looking at the foundation meant looking at history itself. It meant examining the historical antecedents that have brought Fiji to this particular juncture, this particular point in our lives. And as I've written, the professor complained endlessly about the lack of interest in history. And if we were to take a proper look at Fiji's colonial history, we see a deliberate and convenient policy created by the British administration of divide and rule. During the colonial days, the Tauke were confined to the villages, and needed passes if they wanted to leave or travel to any part of the country. They needed passes just to get a drink in a pub. Schools were segregated, and this was no different to apartheid. What ordinary Fijians don't realise is that their beloved paramount chief, Ratu Sir Lala Sukuna, actively supported this convenient arrangement. The Indians, meanwhile, were confined to labouring on the plantations, and the British administrators were, of course, left to savour their God-given status in the community. Each group viewed the other with a mutual degree of suspicion and prejudice that comes from an ignorance when you don't know each other, that comes from a lack of familiarity. It was upon this foundation that the myth of the three-legged stool evolved. The politics of race became the accepted, uncontested mantra of the day. And like most myths, it is something that has been very hard to shed. It has become almost a part of our consciousness in our politics, or in Fiji's politics, and the way it does its politicking. And as we are now only painfully aware, such a state of affairs cannot be sustainable in the long run. I have often been asked by colleagues and friends abroad, why has there never been any kind of a mass protest movement against this militarised government? And I spoke about this with Brij. To all appearances, there is a facade, an air of normality or stability in Fiji. And as long as people can still get up every morning, as long as they can put in a regular 9 to 5 hours in the office or the factory, there will never be any incentive to raise the banner or voice of protest. I am aware that there have been pockets of protest, but what is needed is not pockets of protest. Politics in Fiji, as with anywhere else, is about politics of the stomach, to put it quite crudely. As long as people can continue to put food on the table and feed their children, there will be no Arab Spring. We can talk about the loss of human rights and the lack of choice, but these are abstract concepts to ordinary Fijians. These words have no meaning in their bread and butter reality. And yes, there have been disgruntled voices over Bill 17 and the lack of transparency in the 2013 Constitution and sundry other bills by this government, but a few disgruntled voices does not a revolution make. Itauke Fijians, especially, are not an introspective lot. I would say that they have an incapacity for stock-taking or for serious inquiry or self-reflection. And this is the result of hundreds, if not thousands of years of feudal rule. Within that traditional framework, they were not taught, or rather taught not to question or to challenge authority. They were raised to obey and be submissive. Ia saka, senga saka, nomini lewa saka. According to anthropologists, Itauke or Pacific peoples have been here for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. So you do the maths. Fiji was a British colony for 100 years, and it has been independent for 50 years. How can you compare 3,000 years to 150 years? You can't. This is like expecting them to change overnight, and that simply is not going to happen, and certainly not in our lifetime. Hence the current conundrum that the nation finds itself in, and this is what Brij was pointing to, the lack of an interest in history, or rather the complete ignorance about history and what our roots are, where our roots actually lay. One could even say that the traditional chiefly system has actually been replaced by the incumbent duopoly. You have the same house, you have the same servants, but you have different masters. That said, this so-called stability that we have hangs by a thread. And Brij, probably more than anyone else I know, understood this perfectly. It is a very fragile stability, he wrote, that could easily crumble once Bainimarama goes. I had the good fortune to interview Brij in November. I had no idea then that it was to be his final interview. My last conversation with the good professor was about 2 weeks before I left Melbourne. We had planned to meet up in Melbourne in the new year. But upon reflection, I realised now that he knew in his heart of hearts that he probably wasn't going to make it. His final published piece, which has been mentioned by previous speakers, was essentially, and I agree with Mr. Dutt when he says this, that it was essentially a homage or an epitaph to his beloved homeland. That article, Fiji Made Me, But Which Fiji Is Mine, was published in the November edition of Islands Business magazine. In it, Brij muses over a long-lost, cherished past and condemns the upheavals in recent history. But in between the reminiscences and the mourning, we hear the stirrings of a heart longing for a return to the homeland. Brij may have left Fiji, but it never left him. And it is such a cruel indictment, a brutal indictment, that he was to never again set his eyes on the country of his birth. He was thoroughly versed in the literary classics. He liked to lace his books with a quote or two from James Joyce, from Wordsworth, Coleridge, or other classicists of note. And as we farewell him, the following verses seem appropriate for this son of Tambia who strove only to speak the truth with stinging eloquence. Permit me to quote a couple of verses from Rudyard Kipling's If. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves, to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, if you can wait and not be tired of waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies or being hated. Don't give way to hating. Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Dear sir, may you find your way home, finally, to eternal peace, you gentle son of Tambia. Vinandu Valevu. Dhanibad. Thank you very much.